Hey! Oh, we are so excited. Welcome to a live taping of Think 100%, the coolest show on climate change. Yes, woo! We are here at Netroots Nation. For those who don't know, for our listening audience, Netroots Nation is the largest annual conference for progressives. And for you guys, Think 100%. Rev, tell them what Think 100% is.
Man, first of all, just great to be here. Man, y'all make some noise. I feel so good to hear that. Man, Think 1% is I heard TC also. TC had it down. He had the coolest show on climate change all the way down. But this is a show here, Think 1%, the coolest show on climate change, is a amazing, award-winning podcast that is where young people will win. Y'all believe that?
Young people will win, yes.
And on this podcast, we really do all the issues, the solutions, everything from climate resiliency, climate adaptation, but more important, how we can broaden the climate movement. Because right now, what we believe is that the climate movement, as it is, doesn't allow us to win. So if we can broaden this movement and grow it, meaning that we have more people of color, black, white, brown, red, yellow, male, female, straight, gay, queer, theist, atheist, human, that we can win this climate change movement. So that's what it's all about. Think 100%, the coolest show on climate change.
Hey, yes, yes. And you can find us at think100.info. That is our website. At Think100 Show on Twitter and Instagram. And our podcast is on Spotify, iTunes, and Google Podcasts.
All of that?
All of that.
Yes,
all
indeed.
Of that, yes. So, we would like to introduce our incredible guest. Our incredible guest is one of the youth plaintiffs in the landmark Juliana versus U.S. lawsuit. Yes. Former fellow of for the Alliance for Climate Education, speaker at 2015 COP21 UN conference, frontline campaigner, organizer, and so much more. He is the true definition of youth activism. So before we bring him on, though.
Yeah. You know, before we bring on Vic, let me do two things. First, man, I know this is a live taping, and I know if you're listening to the podcast, I'm going to date the podcast a little bit, but it's really important to me. As many of you know, I'm from the amazing, great state of Louisiana, and being from Louisiana, having gone through Hurricane Katrina, which is now 14 years ago, I sit here today because family and friends are now dealing with flooding all throughout. The French Quarter right now, as I'm talking, is underwater.
Unbelievable.
And possibly Hurricane Barry is barreling down to literally exceed some of the levels in regards to Hurricane Katrina. I say that because, man, when we were dealing with that, it's for me, having gone through that, many of my comrades like Mama D, who are no longer here, and many others are suffering. And so I wanted to bring that up because this issue is not a game to me. Antonique is a survivor from Superstorm Sandy. I've gone through with my family and friends through Hurricane Katrina. And so this is not a game, and it looks like this. It looks like people of color who are on the front lines. And so a lot of times our movement doesn't look like that sometimes. And so those of us who are left behind and left to fight and overcome the challenges of the climate crisis look like black, brown, red people, indigenous people who are left behind. And so this is the reason why we actually do this show. And so my heart is heavy, but I'm not so heavy because when I was looking out to you, I saw these amazing activists here today at Netroots Nation, the warriors of the progressive movement. So you make some noise.
Hey. Yes.
And so with that, one of the things is, June will become the hottest June ever this past June. France had degree weather of 115 degrees Fahrenheit. As I said, back in my home state, Louisiana, right now, the French Quarter is underwater. In D.C., there were flash floods, all around. And so this issue is serious. But one of the things that our movement does, and where we get the thing, we kind of focus heavily on both demonstration and on legislation. That's kind of where our discussion kind of starts. It starts with the standpoint, okay, well, let's demonstrate, which is very important. As many of you know, be in the streets is critical. But also then it goes to let's be in the suites. So let's do it legislation. And both of those are very, very important, how we shape policy, because we know either you shape policy or policy will definitely shape you. So we understand that dynamic in regards to what's important. But where our movement sometimes doesn't focus in, why we want to have this conversation today, was litigation. And we know that demonstration without litigation leads to frustration. And so litigation was so important for us to make sure we had this conversation. And sometimes as a progressive movement, as a climate movement, we don't really get into what litigation is. And sometimes when we try to parallel with the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement used litigation critically to move things forward. And so literally from Brown v. Board of Education, really from the Dred Scott case, to be honest, but really they used litigation to really propel things. So it was people in the streets, folks pushing for legislation, and then also using litigation. But the reason litigation doesn't sometimes move to the forefront is because sometimes it can be kind of boring because you can miss it. It can start, and then it kind of goes to the background. So today's conversation, we want to make sure that we really get into it, that conversation. And with Vic, we have the ultimate, we have somebody who's a person of color, who's queer, who's Latinx, who's also a young person, to be on the stage, to deal with as a plaintiff, but to deal with this issue of litigation. So are y'all ready for this conversation?
Woo!
So listen, when Vic comes out, y'all need to get like hype up in here and make some noise. Y'all wanna make some noise?
Hey! Let's give an extremely warm welcome to our guest, Vic Barrett.
Come on! What's up, Vic?
Hey, it's good. I love this. This is really official.
I know, yeah, we official, you know, Vic, you know. And so we've already told you, Vic, we keep it all the way real on this show, so don't hold back at all. What brought you to working on climate change?
Yeah, when I was 14 years old, I was...
It was like 20 years ago, right?
Right.
6, actually. When I was 14 years old, I was a freshman in high school in New York City, and I had just moved from like a really rural, 98% white community in upstate New York, where I spent like age 0 to 13. And I was just like, I'm in this diverse city with a lot of opportunities and things to know and understand, and so I decided to join this after-school program called the Human Rights Activist Project. And at first I was like, okay, human rights, social justice, those things are really connected and I care about them, so I'll go see what's up with that. And I went, and I remember in the first meeting they told us, so we're gonna be focusing on a campaign that has to deal with climate change. And I remember being like, what does that have to do with anything social justice? And I had failed all my science classes, so I was like, let's see how this goes. But I started learning about environmental racism and about how environmental racism manifested in New York City, and how during Hurricane Sandy, a lot of people that were on the front lines were low-income people of color, because a lot of public housing in New York City is more likely to be built in areas susceptible to flooding. And after learning that, I just remember feeling really frustrated, because it was also at this time where the Black Lives Matter movement was taking off. And I was seeing a lot of news about, like black people being shot in the street by people who are supposed to be protecting us. And I put it into this context of looking at this big issue like climate change. It's really similar. These people who are supposed to be protecting us are perpetuating a violence against us and using our own habitat, our own world to do that. And against black people and against people of color who've always been the biggest protectors of our world and of our natural resources. And the fact that these systems of power were turning our own planet against us was just something that I couldn't ignore. And it kind of just propelled me into doing all the work I'm doing today.
Wow, that's amazing.
No, that is amazing. Vic, you kind of hit on something, and kind of with your lens of looking back on climate change and just the hindsight of how that impacted you. Kind of mentioned the connection, particularly with Black Lives Matter, for instance, and obviously you're from New York.
Yeah.
And so it strikes me because this year actually will be the 50th anniversary of when we all witnessed Eric Garner being choked out in a legal chokehold. And in that, we know that while he was choked out by the police, we also know that within his community, he received an F for air quality. Because 68% of particularly African Americans are within 30 miles of coal-fired power plants. And so we know now, as you're now connecting the dots, looking back on that from where you are now, and obviously, and we're going to get into the case a little bit, but looking back on how climate change affected you and your community, what is some things you think you either saw or missed in that process?
Yeah. I think I saw a lot of just the day-to-day pain and struggle that people like my friends were dealing with. And in ways that were really subliminal, but also like super obvious to me. Like facts that I had a lot of friends that lived in the far Rockaways and lived in areas that were really impacted by Hurricane Sandy, and they had to reroute their whole lives.
And for those who are listening who don't know what the Rockaways are, just tell them what that is. So
yeah, so the far Rockaways are like out past Queens and just where basically like the coast of New York City, I guess you can say. It's where all of us go and hang out in suspicious water at the beaches. If anyone here is from New York, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. But yeah, a lot of my friends that were living in Far Rockaway had to move as far as the Bronx to find housing that they can afford on a short notice, and it changed their day-to-day life every day. The trains they took after school that they had been doing for like years had all of a sudden become different, and just realizing that they couldn't be around a lot of their friends that they had known from their communities, and the ways that changed for them was really impactful for me, because it was just like, I don't know, we're so young, we're in high school, we're already going through all these transitions, all these things that are going on, and I'm also watching the ramifications of like teenagers being literally displaced from their homes and like having to reroute their whole lives because of this natural disaster that we didn't even perpetuate the issue that perpetuated that.
So true.
Anthony, let me real quick follow up on that one, on that regard. So, because I just about this, Vic, you grew up at a time when BLM was really kind of becoming a huge part of your social justice identity, right? And I'm sorry, for the climate activists, it was BLM was Black Lives Matter, not Bureau of Land Management. Just wanted to make sure. Didn't want to throw for my folks in the room on that one. Like, no, how did Bureau of Land Management affect Vic and when he was coming up? I just wanted to clarify that, make sure that was clear. But how do you now see, because a lot of times people discuss in the climate movement like this is the threat, and then and you're a climate activist, but then as a person of color, then we're like, no, we had some threats.
Yeah.
You know, we had some big threats. So before, because we can't even leave our house. If the three of us was left right now and said we left as a climate panel, they'd be, okay, yes, up against the wall. That was a joke, y'all.
Up against the wall, y'all.
Folks of color like, no, ain't no joke in that. No joke in that,
Right.
Rev. But in that process, how would you relate to that? And how would you begin to break down those silos as you see them now between BLM, Black Lives Matter, now also Bureau of Land Management and Black Lives Matter? But how would you break down those things now? I'm just hearing that was a huge part of your identity because you were like 14, right, when this is going on. So when you're seeing Michael Brown, you're seeing Eric Garner, you're seeing Sandra Bland, you're like 14, 15, 16. So how does that now affect you as a climate activist?
Yeah, I think that it really highlighted for me and gave me this privilege of really understanding intersectionality as how it's supposed to stand and like what it means, because these identities, like being Black, intrinsically makes your experience with climate change different than a white person, or even than to an indigenous person or to an Asian person. We're all experiencing climate change in different ways because of the different ways that we stand in our society. And I think that realizing that was really important for me, and then like tying it to Black Lives Matter and that connection is just like, I saw how much emotional energy and emotional charge went into the Black Lives Matter movement, because we're looking at violence, we're looking at people being shot in the street and killed and murdered. And I think that when I was able to take that same level of emotion and apply it also to the idea that people in Louisiana, their homes can be flooded, their lives are being lost, people in the South Bronx have asthma rates that are incredibly high, and their lifespan isn't going to be as high as other people's. It's another way of, killing our community. And I think that really seeing that parallel of like, whether it's somebody pulling out a gun and doing something that people think of as automatically violent, like shooting you, or whether your government is literally just putting you in the line of dying because they care that little about your life. It's the same thing, it's the same connection, and it became so clear to me, and something I couldn't ignore because it's people that look like me who deal with these things every single day.
Yeah, you preaching, Vic. Yes, yes, that is so true. And I felt the same way. I felt like climate change and environmental justice is a Black Lives Matter issue. I made that same, probably around the same, 2014, it was when I entered the
You're
movement.
14 then too?
I was not 14, unfortunately. So yes, it's definitely impressive that you are so young and so wise to understand the issues that a lot of adults are denying, that part. So at 14, though, let's get into this lawsuit. At 14, you got involved in the climate issues, and just 6 years later, at 20 years old, you're still a baby, you are suing the U.S. government. Please
Come on now.
Yes.
Come on now. Oh, y'all can do better than that now.
Yes. Yeah, so tell us about the lawsuit.
Yeah, so I got involved in the lawsuit in 2015, so when I was 16 years old. I was doing a lot of activism in New York City with the Alliance for Climate Education and Global Kids, and working on trying to get offshore wind in New York City, and also trying to mandate climate education in New York City public schools K through 12. And I was really involved in these campaigns and doing a lot of work with them, and I was speaking at press conferences and harassing city council members. And finally, after working with the Alliance for Climate Education for a while, they connected me to Youth v. Gov, or Our Children's Trust. And I talked to some representatives from Our Children's Trust, and they basically just explained to me that they take legal action in order to answer to the climate issue. And so I'm on the phone with them, and they're like, all right, like, how does this sound to you? Basically, the premise is that we sue the US federal government for denying your generation's rights to life, liberty, and property by actively perpetuating the global climate crisis through subsidizing fossil fuels. So through subsidizing fossil fuels and just supporting an energy infrastructure that we know doesn't work. And also with tangible proof that we have that they've known since about the 1960s that climate change could be potentially catastrophic, and then still took direct action to continue to mine fossil fuels and perpetuate the issue. And at 16, I was like, that sounds dope. Yeah, I'd love to do that. Especially like coming from the experience of being a youth activist and not having voting power, but having to deal with all these legislative people, and knowing that I would go into their offices with my friends, and we would have talking points, we would have policy points, we would be totally prepared for these meetings at like 15, 16 years old, and the politicians would walk in not really knowing why we were even there, but being super excited to take a photo with us afterwards, because like you have a whole bunch of like black and brown teenagers in your office. And I think that after just having to like struggle so much with that, with being totally ignored by people because I didn't have the necessary power to vote for them, even though I was talking about an issue that disproportionately impacted my generation, was really frustrating and disheartening. And just the aggressive stance of really like putting the facts about climate change in front of the people who are perpetuating this issue and forcing them to have to answer to them sounded amazing and entertaining. Yeah.
You know, Vic, I just want to say this to you. I want to hear more about the other plaintiffs, but I also just want to tell you this. We've met some of the other plaintiffs actually on this show. They've come on, Jessica and others, actually Kelsey, and I want you to talk more about that, but I actually want to take just a moment here and just tell you this, man, how proud I am of y'all.
Yeah.
Man,
Yes.
it's super. You know, it takes, I mean, it takes a lot. You know, you've put your name and all of you as children, something that we as adults should be doing. All of us should be suing this damn government, to be honest. But I just wanted to tell you that because, and I also want to tell you just the real side, because I also know the other side of how when you do those things, what they are. Because I know for me personally, you know, I was, probably don't look like it now, but I was an officer in the U.S. Air Force, and I actually spoke out against the war in Iraq. And my own government sued me as a conduct of becoming an officer and a threat to national security, and was being court-martialed. Like, wow, my whole life was upturned. And so it was real fun with activists in the streets. Yeah, this is great, you know, me, and we out there, and it was great. But then it was like afterwards, this government was coming at me to put me in prison. But, you know, I just thank, you know, the Almighty that, you know, that justice is what's the side you need to be on.
Yeah.
And so I just want to tell you that regardless of whatever comes at you, at the end of it, that you're on the right side of history.
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
Thank you so much for that.
No, definitely. So with that, talk about some of the other plaintiffs, because I know it's 21 of y'all, 22?
21, yeah. So there's 21 plaintiffs from all over the United States, ranging in age from 11 to 23. Yeah, and so basically all the plaintiffs in their own communities were either doing activism work and also have complaints that we filed in our declaration. So every single plaintiff has specific issues in their locale that contributes, that's based in climate change. So for example, we have Levi, who's our youngest plaintiff. He's 11 years old. He lives in Satellite Beach, Florida. And he's homeschooled, and he spends every day swimming at the beach and surfing and climbing through the trees and finding shellfish and things like that. But all
So
of that
I needed that homeschool when I was home.
Right,
I didn't go to homeschool, but there was ever a homeschool I was going to go
Exactly.
to, it was going to be that homeschool.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel that. And he has such a nice, like, consistent tan. It's great. But yeah, he lives in Satellite Beach, Florida, which is really susceptible to sea level rise. And his community is totally at risk from sea level rise. And he's already had to move once to a whole new community in his young age. And it just impacts him on the day-to-day with the weather, anytime there's a storm, his whole area floods. We have a plaintiff, Jaden, who lives in Rain, Louisiana. When they had that huge flooding in Baton Rouge 2 years ago, maybe, her whole house was flooded, totally devastated, had to move. We have plaintiffs in Colorado that deal really terribly with asthma, forest fires. Plaintiffs in Alaska. Alaska just had a 90-degree day this month. Which is crazy.
That's crazy.
So yeah, just basically young people from all over the country with stories and impacts, but also voices that they.
So those who are listening, make sure you said it was a 90-degree weather night, because you kind of said Baton Rouge and went to Alaska. Make sure those who are listening, you didn't say 90-degree weather in Baton Rouge, you said 90-degree weather in
Alaska.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. So basically all of these things are in our complaints. Also, we talk about, like, part of my complaint and some of the other plaintiffs' complaints is the psychological and developmental damage of climate change on our growth. And these are all part of, like, our declarations for the court and what gives us standing to sue the government. Yeah.
Wow. I'm taken back because I'm just thinking about my childhood. Like, 11 years old, I was playing with Barbies and singing in church and things like that. And the courage, the amount of courage that it takes to take the kind of stance that you guys are taking from ages 11 to, you said, 22? Crazy.
And Levi's been doing it for a quarter of his life now. Some of the
That's
plaintiffs have been doing it for, Levi's been doing it for a
amazing.
third of his life. Some of them have been doing it for a quarter of their lives. Mine's been for like a fifth of my life.
Wow.
We've been suing the
That's
government.
incredible.
That's part of it. It's crazy.
So, how does it feel to sue the government?
Now hold on,
Like,
Anthony.
what-
Anthony, hold on, Anthony. You just went. Now I'm just saying. You just killed everything with us right there, and there. You just went So these young folks are here suing the government. You say, well, now this guy was playing with Barbies. And you know, you can't, we got to be more radical than that. You got to think Barbies would fist or something.
Well, I did do a little revolt at my school because they didn't give us Martin Luther King Jr. Day off.
There you
so
go.
I got that overturned. So I was a little activist.
Okay.
I spent the majority of my time playing with Barbies and stuff. I wasn't suing nobody. So what the heck does that feel like? Like what is that experience like? And I know, I'm sure, like I said, we have a whole group of very ignorant adults who deny everything we're talking about. And I know and a lot of them are radical, and sometimes, you know, AOC talks about her morning coffee is as she's drinking her morning coffee, she's looking at the people who have threatened to kill her and seeing their faces and making sure that her team knows who they are and all that kind of stuff. So this world can get really crazy.
Yeah.
And so just in general, what the heck does it feel like to be 20 years old suing the U.S. government?
Yeah, it's insane and surreal, and like a lot goes into it, whether it's like the traveling or the security. Security is a really big issue for us. Talking to press all the time, talking to media, doing interviews. It's definitely like changed how I've grown up and changed how I understand the world. Just because since I was 16, I've been having to periodically like do an interview on the phone when I want to be hanging out with my friends or like go on a trip to speak at some event when like I'd rather go on my school field trip or things like that. So it's definitely had like a lot of interesting impacts and a lot of like this thought in my head where it's like, why? I love doing the work, but also you see youth activists all over this country sacrificing like big chunks of themselves to fix something that they haven't caused, but feel so desperate to change that like they're willing to like give up those little pieces of themselves. I think
hold on, I think you just said something that was very profound. You got to break that down though. What does that mean for somebody who, at 16, starts really as young as 11 in some cases, but now for you and who's still young and at 20. But break that down. What's that mean to now have to fix the problem of folks who are literally stealing your future? You're suing literally for your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You're suing simply to live. You're suing for clean air, clean water. What does that mean to you? Just so listen, y'all, you lived, we want to live. You kind of said that. You got to kind of break that one down a little bit.
Yeah, exactly what you're saying. I mean, I think about all the plaintiffs. I think about Levi, who we have 11 years, the IPCC says, until we have irreversible catastrophic climate change. And in 11 years, Levi's going to be around my age. And I don't even know what that would look like for me. I mean, I know in 11 years I'll be 31, and I don't even know what this earth is going to be like.
Right.
And it's really weighing, and it's like really this existential crisis that a lot of young people deal with all the time. But I think a lot of young people find a lot of energy in doing the work that we do and have a lot of motivation to do it. And it's really unifying for us, like this struggle, but also like it feels good to know that we're doing what we can to push back against it, to know that we can say at the end of the day that we did everything for generations before us, even though generations behind us didn't do that for us. And I think that it's really like redeeming for our generation, if anything, to kind of try to change the tide of caring about posterity, caring about what's coming next.
You breaking my heart. I mean, it's crazy because it's just the standpoint of that literally. And I want to get into your personal story and that breakdown, but it's just the standpoint that, man, I just want to say this. It doesn't matter if you are Democrat or Republican, this should be about humanity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Human beings.
And the fact that children are suing for their future should be alarming.
Yeah.
In that aspect.
Suing for basic human rights. Clean air and clean water. It doesn't get more basic than that. So there are 21 plaintiffs in the Juliana versus U.S. case, all very diverse backgrounds. You yourself carry a number of identities. You're Black, Afro-Indigenous, Latinx, queer, young, and first generation. How do your identities inform your climate activism?
Yeah. I think that growing up, I realized pretty quickly that I was in a vulnerable spot, being gay and being black and being Latinx, and also, like I said, growing up in a 98% white, rural, conservative community in upstate New York.
So, Vic, you like this fight? You just ready to fight anything? You just like, well, listen, I'm already this. I'm just gonna fight regardless.
Well, what's actually interesting is I feel like because I was in such an uncomfortable space, I realized that I would need to protect myself and like adapt in a lot of ways. And I realized that the thing I needed most in my life was protection and support. And as I got older and got to move to New York City and found more instances where I could have that support and protection, I realized also how many people lack that every day still and what that does to a person. And I think like going throughout my whole life, just knowing I'm so different, being in all these margins of society, and still just trying to push through, like still having to do every day, you know, it's like you can't just stop doing it, you can't stop. But just being aware of that and knowing that people all over the world like me feel this way all the time and are even feeling it in ways that I can't even imagine. People all over the world that hold the same identities as me wouldn't be on this stage, like getting to talk to people and have people care about what I'm saying.
Right.
And I think just trying to like open up any space that I possibly can. A lot of my life, like being black and Afro-Latinx and Afro-Indigenous, and in a lot of spaces like the UN or the World Economic Forum, just these spaces like filled by like rich white decision makers, it was never comfortable, but I knew I had to be there because I knew that the people actually suffering were people that looked like me. And if I wasn't there able to talk about it.
Come on, Vic, say that.
And if I wasn't there able to talk about it, then who would be? And I think that a lot of holding those identities just gives me so much empathy for even people that maybe don't necessarily have those identities, but are still living on the margins of society, not even just in the United States, but around the world. I just think a lot about people in developing nations that are on the front lines of climate change, that are thinking right now, like, where's my whole island nation gonna go? And like, I feel like even if I haven't felt it on that scale, I can totally relate to that fear of just like being screwed because of what you were born as and where you exist and like not having any control over that.
You
So-
are extraordinary, Vic. I just have to say that. Oh my God.
So Vic, I want to make sure for this next, I want to make sure pull your mic up close because I want to make sure we're gonna have some real. We having real tough. I want to get deep into it. So you mentioned something that's very important about where taking with who you are and going into different spaces because it's important to be in those spaces. So this is the thing. We on this panel right now are 3 people of color. We have a climate movement that is challenged sometimes by being a Birkenstock movement, let's say it like that.
That's a nice way of saying it, Red.
A little Birkenstock, a little East Coast, West Coast. And this movement sometimes looks upon people of color, indigenous communities, sometimes more as the victims than as leaders. And even when you have, I don't know if you saw this, there's a report that came out a few years ago, and it had another report. It was a report that came out that was called Green 2.0. For all of us, those who are listening right now, you should definitely go and check that out. Green 2.0, a great report that came out that said that, you know, most of the top leadership within environmental organizations is white. And it showed that it was like mostly white, like 85% white. And then they had a second report that came out, Vic, volume 2, that said that
This is crazy too.
that it got whiter. like they literally didn't. Some of them didn't get better. It went from 85% white to 95% white in some cases. Now in cities like D.C., New York, it's like, damn, you gotta work real hard to be that white. You know what I'm saying? You gotta like go out your way. Good God, you gotta go out your way to be.
That's hilarious.
But it gets worse. Then they came out in June, which was also the
God.
hottest June we ever had in June. They had the same had a report that was called Leaking Talent, that said that even when there are people of color at these organizations,
This is very sad.
that it's such a toxic environment for people of color, black, red, and brown, that black and red and brown people literally would rather leave the movement that they want to fight for
Don't even
than
feel
stay
welcome.
within that kind of environment, because it is so unhealthy for them to be in. That's out of control.
Out of control.
So what you just said here, I'm just wondering, based upon that, as you're looking on that, and this, we're being real, because the one thing about the Cooler Show, this show actually is very fortunate. We have a large, this show primarily is those listening, actually your group, that's why you're here, Gen Z and millennials and people of color are one of the largest listeners to the Cooler Show on climate change, and they're listening, but they also, like you, just like, man, this is not it. So particularly that one question of, why do you think this movement continues to make those who are, and I say like this, why doesn't this movement try to find the Fannie Lou Hamers of the climate movement in a way in which they can find people who may be outside, that genius outside the academy? They may not put the nouns with the verbs and the verbs with the adjectives all together, but when they say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, there's something that just rattles through your soul when the way they say it is so authentic. Why do you think this movement does not allow for those in that community, even after Standing Rock, even after all we've seen with pipeline fights, why do they still just marginalize people of color and refuse to put them in leadership positions?
Yeah, it's tough. I've worked with a lot of organizations in the amount of times I've been doing this, and yeah, it permeates the culture of environmental activism. And even when I first started doing climate change work, like, it was really disappointing, because a lot of my friends of color, a lot of my black friends were like, why would you be a climate activist? Like, with everything that's going on in our community. And also, like, isn't that for white people? Like, that's where a lot of the attitude comes from. And I think that it kind of ties back to the same thought I had initially when I joined into the movement, where I was like, what does climate change have to do with social justice? And I think that because climate change is such an issue of science and is such an existential crisis, that it's been intellectualized so much and like made into such an academic thing that's so inaccessible to the people that are actually struggling with it. And you see a lot of these nonprofit organizations that exist right now that are like really popular were founded by like Ivy League white students who like had the education, also had the time and the resources to totally throw themselves into front lines, or not to throw themselves into activism work. And I think that it's still an issue with like breaking down that border, like still making people understand, even on like our side, like talking to other black people, a lot of the times I have to be like, no, but I promise it won't be that bad. But then I'm like, am I setting you up for like, I don't know. And I think that, it's a huge problem in environmental organizations. And I think that people are very blind to the fact that a lot of the resilience and a lot of the solutions exist in those communities of color, and get really caught up in a savior complex. And like, as a person of color, we all know like savior complexes have like fueled most of the like violence, colonialism, like imperialism of world history. And I think that a lot of white climate activists don't realize that that's what they're perpetuating when they try to take control. I think that a lot of times maybe they rationalize it to themselves of like, oh, well, I'm taking some weight off the shoulders of like all these people of color. But really it's like, we're way past that. Weight has been on the shoulders for centuries, and we've been able to carry it. We figured it out. We got it. But like, let us just tell you how to help us. Let us tell you like what we need. And yeah.
That's good, Vic. So we're all people of color, and we all know people of color and poor communities are on the front lines. They are the ones suffering the most, and it's most urgent. The climate change issue and the lack of environmental justice and climate justice is urgent. It's right here, it's urgent. People are dying, it's scary, it's crazy. So is that urgency overwhelming, or is that urgency empowering?
Yeah, I think that the feeling, like the overwhelming feeling and the empower and like the empowerment kind of have to coexist in a lot of ways. I think that if there wasn't some light at the end of the tunnel, if there wasn't something that was motivating all these people to do this, then everything would be just stuck in the like gloom and doom and like overwhelmingness of the issue. It's like the largest existential issue to ever like come across mankind.
Yeah.
And yeah, that could be real weighty.
Yeah.
So if there wasn't something there at the end of the day to make people feel good about it, no one would even do the work. And I think that that urgency really unifies a lot of people to want to do everything they can to answer to the issue. I think that we see a lot of examples right now, especially with young people. Doing this work for so long, young people have never been engaged in the way they are now, with like knowing about climate change, caring about it, and wanting to make like the best protest sign poster for it. And I think that has a lot to do with just the true sense of urgency with all these studies coming out, all these things that are talking about like what has to happen in the next decade. A lot of young people are waking up and being like, oh, this is scary. Oh, you're scared too? Like, let's do something together about it. And I think that's really the empowering part of urgency. That's really what makes urgency able to motivate and activate people, because it's like, well, we can't just sit around, can we?
Right. We can't just sit around, or there'll be no place to sit around.
Literally.
Right, literally. Like, yes, literally, no place, like no earth. Well, the earth will be here. We won't be here. I always say Mother Earth will be fine. She'll keep turning. She'll be doing her thing. We just won't be here, which sucks.
Got a little bit, yeah.
Just a little bit. So we have a clip in April of 2016.
Before you get to that clip,
Okay.
can I just do one follow-up to that
Yeah,
to that question to
of
Vic?
course.
Vic, I need you, now you're 20, right?
Yeah.
You're kind of an OG. But a lot of the listeners to Think 1% the coolest show on climate change are in Gen Z and also millennials. And you mentioned something about the mental anguish of this movement. I mean, the scope. And you think about that, the difference between even with the civil rights movement, which was primarily dealing with equality, is that the movement you're dealing with for climate justice is dealing with existence, right? And so I kind of want you just to speak for just a quick second to your peers. Because if you're speaking to those who are fighting, who are like 16, and you were there, just like 4 years ago, but 16 and 15 and young people, I'm as a person who's older, am concerned that, man, to hear about from the IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to hear that report and to know that we have 11 years, there's something to your psyche, right? So I guess just a little bit, just kind of this, what kind of keeps you going? And then we'll get to that clip.
Yeah. I think that it's often attributed to our generation, maybe particularly like Gen Z, younger millennials, that we tend to be like hyperbolic and that our humor is dark. But I think that is really reflective of like the world that we've grown up in. Like we have like all these like grand statements and do these grand things because we like have lived in a time where ridiculous things are happening. And I know that it's like, oh, ridiculous things have always been happening throughout human history, but we're talking about like catastrophic climate change and only 10 years to deal with that. We're talking about in the United States, like we saw the March for Our Lives movement take off because, young people were just tired of the fact that they can get shot in their school, which is like a ridiculous thing for a young person to have to be tired of. But we see like all these like insane things that are manifesting in our lives, and like it kind of plays back to what we were saying before, like, but this is our reality. It's like not like we've known something else. So like part of it, that's part of why we're like the best people to deal with it and most equipped to deal with it. But also like that just speaks to like how desensitized we are to the fact that like our world is like falling apart in so many ways, and our society is falling apart in so many ways, and it's also like simultaneously just being handed to us by the nature of like how growing up works. And I think that we're just really frustrated with the idea or the fact or like the notion that we have to like inherit this world, this like messed up world that we didn't really create but have had to like grow up in, and we don't want to perpetuate the rest of, all these things that we see going on. And I think that's a huge motivator and like a huge factor as to why like young people are really activated today to just like try to do something. And I think like speaking to young people particularly, I feel like the advice that I usually give to young people who are trying to get involved in activism is that I think that youth activism in this way, because it's taken off so much in our generation, has also become celebritized in a lot of ways. And I feel like I try to, tell other youth activists, like, you don't have to be in a Now This video to be a good youth activist. Or like, you don't have to have like
a million followers.
On followers on Twitter to be a good youth activist. You don't have to like be a social media expert to be a good youth activist, because like that's not what we want to make activism. I think that a lot of times my generation is like on the cusp of being like, one of my friends calls it like clicktivists. It's like,
Wow.
or like you're retweeting something or signing a petition, so like that's your activism. And I think that a lot of people get caught up in that because they think in order to be like an in the streets activist, you have to be the loudest person in the room and you have to be leading all the rallies. And a lot of my generation is just like not that type of person. And I think that I really try to just push the accessibility of it. Like there's so many. The reason that so many people can get involved in this movement is because, like, with any movement, any skills that you have, if you're a musician, like, if you're a visual artist, if you write poetry, if you like to build things, if you're an engineer, there's space for you in the movement to do something to help somebody. And I think that's usually what I try to push. Like, don't get caught up in the glamour.
Man, that's such an important, that's real talk. Real talk.
That is real talk.
Anthony, not a video you would say. I'm sorry.
No, I'm glad you did that. That was great. We needed to hear that for sure. So the clip. In 2016, Vic spoke to the United Nations. Yes, on climate change. And we're going to play just a piece of the speech. And in the clip, Vic refers to goals. He's talking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. For context, as you're listening.
Also for context, I'm 16 in this video. I had a little glow up. We need a movement powered by young people that invites us and engages us. We need to hear the stories of people and places being affected, and we need global leadership to work towards our long-term existence and not short-term gratification. In 2030, the year in which the global goals will be met, I'll be 31 years old. I may have a family, and I want to be able to tell my children that I did all that I could for them. That we did all that we could for them. We have been given the chance to change the course of human history. The global goals look past the things that we let divide us. They work towards the version of humanity that I know we can become. We have reached the moment in our history where we need to decide how much humanity means to us. How much do we mean to ourselves? In this, the Anthropocene, we must ensure that we are not characterized or held prisoner by our mistakes of the past, but that we are defined by our perseverance and bravery of the present. Join young people around the world in celebrating the best possible version of our future.
Amazing.
Come on.
Amazing.
That was all right there, Vic.
Yeah.
And I want to be able to.
Oh. Okay.
I like we're gonna do
Is there more?
get the reverse angle of that. No, so Vic, let me just say this. So when you spoke to the UN then, the UN now has come out that we have now 11.5 years. And so, and let me be very clear, 11.5 years before we can't do what we need to do. So really moving into climate adaptation fully. Like we can still make enough changes to somewhat reverse the climate crisis. Not fully, we're actually, many cases where we've gone too far along in that. But the situation now is that as we get ready and we move forward, what is your message now? So you gave that message 4 years ago. What is your message now, particularly on the backdrop of the IPCC report?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting looking at my transition from like engaging with spaces like the UN then to engaging with those spaces now, because I think I've gotten a little jaded in a way.
Well, explain that.
Well, like when I first gave this speech, it was to the UN General Assembly, and it was this really insane experience where like the invitation I got was asking if I was like a crown prince or princess or like a foreign minister and things like that. And I'm like, nope, just a kid. And I remember that just being a really surreal experience, but also like, to me, it was like the most pivotal thing that I could do. And then also with going to, before that, I had gone to COP21, where the Paris Agreement was drafted. And this was in conjunction with the signing of the Paris Agreement in New York City. And I just remember like going to COP and having so much hope, because I'm like, we're gonna make an internationally binding agreement that finally brings all these countries together in the way that we need to in order to make a difference. And then I was on the ground there, and I noticed some things that were really like odd to me, just the fact that like civil society or the people who were actually being affected by any of the things that were going on in the room had to stand outside of it to protest and had to like beg for attention, basically. And I had this really amazing experience going to Poland in December for COP25. And I think the way that I engaged with this space was totally different than the way I would have 3 years ago, which is that instead of like focusing on where I could speak and who could hear me or who would be willing to hear me, I was working with this amazing group of young people to plan direct actions to like force our voices to be heard. And one of the big actions that we did with my friend Christy, who's right there, she was a delegate with me, also works a lot on social media about people of color in the environmental movement. You should follow her, Brown Girl Green, on Instagram.
Hey, I like that.
Yeah, but so we made this amazing plan that there was a US panel that was at COP25, which was the only panel that the United States sent, and it was to talk about the future of fossil fuels, and to talk about how fossil fuels were basically like a viable option for future energy resources, which is obviously untrue.
Right.
But it was the US Department of Energy that was like holding this panel, and it was the only presence that the United States had at this international conference to talk about climate change and how we were going to deal with it. So we decided that we were going to basically do a mass interruption and like flood the room with young activists. So we had like the whole center of the room, like probably sat like 300 people seated with youth activists. And then we basically just like midway into their panel just started laughing. Like everyone in the room like erupted in laughter. And so they all stopped talking. And then we basically just like took the mic, we went to the front, we had indigenous people talking, young people talking, I spoke, and basically just like gave a whole spiel about like why what was going on was wrong and who they should actually be listening to, and then all left the room. So it basically left the room empty for this panel.
That is so gangster.
I love that. I love that.
Mic drop. Oh my God. That's dope, y'all. That is dope.
So that's something I probably wouldn't have thought to do like when I was 16, and it was just like excited to be allowed into the space. I felt like I was being given, I was being graced with like being brought into the space, and then like the way that my activism transformed, it's like now I just feel really determined to take that space.
Come on now.
That's
we
amazing.
need to. And yeah, that was definitely like a really transformative experience between like engaging that way and then like working up to where I'm at now.
So dope. I love that. Okay. So that's a little radical, which I appreciate that. I love that. And so now we have an administration. I won't say too much about them, but they've, taken us out of the Paris Agreement and just think climate change is a
But
whole.
you gotta say a lot about them, though, because
I don't like to
the
talk about 'em. I don't
because
like
if folks don't vote, they'll be around for another 4
Oh,
more
Lord
years.
Jesus, don't vote for him, y'all. Please,
So-
if you are listening, do not do that again.
You gotta make sure you vote.
Yes, vote.
Make sure you get out
Please
and
vote. So, with that said, with the craziness we have going on, with the people running the country right now, who have said on record they believe climate change is a hoax, although he said he didn't say that, and then there's videos that he said it, and then you show him the video, and he's like, but I didn't say it, which is, okay, that's just crazy. How radical with the fight that we're in, and the urgency of the 11 years, which is not long at all. I mean, not long at all. And like Rev said, that we already passed the point of going back. What we're going through right now, all the craziness, the storms like right now in Louisiana, like what you told us earlier, is so sad that those people are about to go through the same thing they went through before. Hopefully, we're praying that it won't be as bad. But how to fight that?
Yeah.
How radical do we need to be to approach these leaders about climate change? Like, how do we push them? How radical do we need to be to push that?
Yeah.
And in this is one of your, the last question, make sure you also give any other information you want to give on top of that, like how to find you and all that good stuff.
Yeah. So I would say, like, with how radical we have to be is extremely. We're dealing with an issue that, like I've said multiple times, is coming fast, it's coming hard, and, like, it's huge. And I think that there's a lot of ways that people think of the word radical and, like, what that means to them. I think, to me, that, like, one of the first things that a lot of people need to do is get it out of their head that, or well, this might be a little controversial, but to really look at, like, the systemic issues and the people, because this is an issue being fueled by people, and not a whole bunch of people, and not us either. Like,
Right.
people with, like, you know, names and lives and existences that, like, walk the earth day to day are fueling this crisis. Like, they, like,
Right.
they're not mysterious. Like, you find their names, you can find
Not
a
the
lot of, like,
boogeyman,
yeah,
right.
exactly. And I think that, like, looking at that as the issue and not thinking about, and not letting people try to, like, guilt you or shame you into, like, there's a plastic straw in your drink, and things like that, because I think that really puts a lot of the population, like, turns a lot of them off, and is often a lot of really inaccessible to, like, poor people and people of color. Like, you can't tell a poor person living in a food desert in Harlem that, like, they now have to shop at the Whole Foods and be vegan. That doesn't make sense, and
Yes.
it doesn't work. And I think that a lot of what's also radical in the way that we could address this issue is by taking some of the power out of these leadership positions, like basically turning away from them, turning away from begging them for everything that we want, and turning in towards ourselves and, like, manifesting and really, like, uplifting the power that we have in our own communities and our ancestry, and, like, the fight that a lot of these communities have been doing for a really long time, especially when it comes to communities of color. Just turning away from politicians that have never helped us and probably never will, and turning into our community that has always helped us, and it's always been what's pushed us to keep going and to actually make the changes that we want to see. And I think that, like, knowing that politicians aren't the answer to this issue is one of the most radical things that you can do to answer to it, I would say. And then, about how to contact me? Is that
Yeah, tell us how to
well, you
help.
said something. We said before you give your contact. Let me just again, on behalf of Think 1%, man, thank you so much.
Thank you, Vic. Yes.
Give it
thank
up
you
for
for
you.
having
You are extraordinary.
I want you to. Definitely want you to give, for those who are listening, you know, how to reach you, you know, how to find out more about the case. But I want to say this, because Anthony made a great point, which is so true, about, you know, we got to vote, and this administration, let me get some water on this one.
Oh, yeah. You got to drink some water on when you talk about this administration.
But I would also add this, Anthony. Make sure I clear my throat. Is that I also hold Democrats accountable.
Yes, absolutely.
Because it's a shame that we're begging for a climate debate. It's a shame that we have to go forth to get a Green New Deal and everybody. It's a shame that they're not listening to young people. It's a shame that that's the case. So,
say it.
While I am fully understanding what this administration is and this threat to us, it is. I don't care anymore about if there's an R or a D. None of that is going to matter 100 years from now.
Preach.
100 years from now, none of us will be here. But what will be here will be our activism. And if we have the courage to stand up to anybody before us. And so it's not going to matter if they say this or that. What's going to matter is that 100 years from now, this lawsuit that you're putting forth, fighting for these children and fighting for the next generation, Vic, that lawsuit, the same way like Brown v. Board of Education, the same way with Roe v. Wade, the same way that we can now have marriage equality, the same way that same way we're now fighting for us to have a livable planet, that lawsuit will allow for the next generation who won't even know us or see us or understand us, but they will benefit from that lawsuit. And for that, we as humans say thank you.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And on that, tell them how to find you.
Yes, that was definitely well deserved. I'm glad we did that.
Y'all made my ears all hot.
He was like, should I stand? Like, nah, this for you. You sit. Take that. Take that. You deserve it.
Yeah, to find out more about the lawsuit, you could go on youthvgov.org and see the stories of all the other plaintiffs. My Instagram is vicbarrett_. It's real easy. My Twitter is vict_Barrett. So there's a T after the Vic on that. I wish I wrote this down or something. But also, yeah, if any of you want to talk to me more, just one-on-one, I'll just be here. So that's also an option. Those are the ways to contact me.
No, thank you.
Thank
How do
you.
you get us on Think 100? How do you find us?
Yes, at Think 100 Show on Twitter and Instagram. Our website is think100.info, and our podcast is on iTunes, Spotify, and Google, what's it called? Google